Situated along the Sava River's edge, within a sunken, moist region, lay a facility that diverged from the industrial pattern of other European camps. Jasenovac caused even visiting SS officers to freeze upon reaching its grounds. No gas chambers or organized crematoria existed there. They were improvised barracks, workshops, crooked fences, and a management style that adapted continuously. In this spot, brutality relied not on machinery, but on human choices repeated daily. Violent sentries, cruel foremen, administrative clerks, and common citizens joined forces in a slaughter system, unlike anything previously witnessed. How did such a savage entity, which gave even Germans nightmares, start operating? The emergence of an unimaginable sight. The roots of Jasenovac are tied directly to Yugoslavia's disintegration during the spring of 1941. In April, the German and Italian incursion obliterated the Yugoslav nation within mere days. The military crumbled, governance halted, and the land was split between invaders and their regional partners. In that void, the independent state of Croatia was declared. A regime formed under Axis tutelage, without prior institutional foundations, and with an urgent necessity to enforce command. Authority landed with the Ustasha movement, an extremist group that previously functioned in exile and secrecy. Its chiefs returned with German and Italian backing and seized control without a solid state framework. They possessed armed factions and a clear ideology, but missed the administrative bodies needed to run a nation at war. From the earliest days, they marked whole population segments as internal foes and commenced arrests, banishments, and local killings. That method quickly became ungovernable. Widespread detentions flooded jails, police posts, and whole villages. The rampant brutality spawned disorder, disrupted governance, and strained ties with German allies who insisted on stability. The government required a centralized site for imprisonment and punishment under direct supervision, distant from city centers, yet linked to the transit grid. It was not yet pursuing a lasting camp, but rather a feasible answer. Jasenovac fulfilled that requirement. The zone provided a railway, river entry, deserted industrial structures, and a position enabling rapid activity without major building or public justifications. It was an available location during a period when time was the rarest asset. Therefore, Jasenovac emerged not as a design plotted from the start, but as a pressing reply to a dilemma the new nation had generated and did not understand how to handle. The query that lingers is what occurs when a makeshift fix turns into a lasting institution. The camp fell under the jurisdiction of the Supervisory Service, a police body formed to function without legal review. The key figure was Vyacheslav Lubaric, named to manage the camp network. He was no administrator. He hailed from a history of direct engagement, held a direct link to the regime's heads, and functioned with significant freedom. Their duty was not managing captives, but ensuring outcomes. He had passed years in exile, joining in armed operations, assaults, and covert planning. He lacked official administrative or martial schooling, yet he possessed background in direct suppression and personal devotion to the state leadership. That mix made him valuable at a time when the fresh state required men ready to operate without asking permission or leaving trails. Lubaric viewed power as the instant fulfillment of commands, even when those decrees were unwritten. His ascent resulted from technical worth and his capacity to enforce order via dread and fix issues others chose not to recognize. On location, the Jasenovac facility was arranged into various dispersed subcamps, including Krapje, Brokitz, and the old brick plant linked by internal paths and the railroad. There existed no written codes comparable to those in German camps. Commands were issued verbally, shifted often, and relied on the officer in charge at that moment. The command chain was brief and personal. This rendered the system swift, but also erratic. Choices could be reached and executed on the identical day. From a technical view, Jasenovac was not designed as an industrial site. There were no gas chambers or crematoria planned for non-stop use. Mastery was maintained via simple barriers, lookout posts, and armed squads. The implements at hand were those located in the vicinity: pistols, rifles, labor tools converted into punishment devices. Homicide was not distinct from detention. It was part of the location's daily operation. That remains one of the primary distinctions from the German camps. Here, no separation was attempted between slayer and victim. There was also a crucial administrative variation. While German sites answered to a centralized bureaucracy with specific files, Jasenovac functioned with scarce and broken documentation. Many arrivals went unregistered. Numerous transfers left no mark. This absence of paperwork was not an error, but a method of working. It permitted adaptability and lessened formal duties. The camp could expand, alter, or empty without needing to validate every move. In that setting, the site started taking people even before it was wholly arranged. Facilities and brutality progressed together. The initial few months did not adhere to a steady model. There were uneven transfers, short gatherings, and swift disappearances. There was still no established routine, yet the stream never ceased. The issue that stays open is how such a shaky system managed to uphold itself when increasing numbers of people started to appear. The captives without a name and without a digit. The initial prisoners came to Jasenovac without rosters, without digits, and without clarification. They walked out of sealed rail wagons after hours or days of journey, their garments sticking to their forms and their mouths parched. There was no intake office or desk to record names. The sorting was performed standing upon the mud with a motion of the hand or a strike from a rifle stock. One survivor remembered that the sentry would inspect their hands. If they were calloused, the man would go one path. If they were smooth, another. No person knew what it signified. Occasionally, it meant nothing. At times, it determined whether someone would survive that evening. Nothing was clarified on the dock. Quiet was part of the process. Most of the early groups were Serbs captured in hamlets in Bosnia and Krajina. They came as crowds, not as persons. They did not request names, only where they hailed from such and such town, from the far bank of the river. One account details how an Ustasha officer yelled, "These are all identical." And that sufficed. Whole families were driven together toward the barriers. The males were split apart without notice. Some never viewed their offspring again. A peasant remembered watching his father step toward a barn and vanish behind a steel gate. That entry never unsealed again that day. Identity had substituted any personal past. It did not matter what they had committed. What counted was who they were. The Jews came from cities like Zagreb, Osijek, and Sarajevo following quick raids. Many held papers thinking they were still valid. In Jasenovac, there existed no distinct path or set goal. There was no discussion of future moves. Some sentries mentioned labor, others chuckled. One observer narrates that a male asked loudly how long he would be remaining there. The reply was a blow to the visage. Distinct from the German sites, there was no methodical numbering or marking. The absence of logs produced a distinct sensation. Not being tallied was worse than being tallied. It implied that nobody would ask queries later. The Roma were handled differently from the very start. They were not mingled with other factions. They were held apart as soon as they appeared, frequently at night. A Serbian survivor remembered hearing kids chanting behind a crude barrier and the following dawn seeing nobody. There were no rosters of Roma. There were no lasting barracks for them. Whole families were removed from the camp in sealed groups and never returned. The vanishing was rapid, nearly administrative. In subsequent stories, the identical sentence always shows up. They never returned. There are no accounts of what happened next, only the recognition of emptiness. Women and youths posed a distinct issue. The facility was not fitted to house them in huge amounts. There were no extra garments or divided living areas. They were heaped up in moist barns or windowless structures. A Serbian female testified that they went 3 days without meals, sitting on the ground with the kids weeping feebly. Some mothers attempted to cover their children's ears during the nighttime wails. They did not continually succeed. The youngsters did not grasp where they were. They inquired when they were going home. No person replied. In certain instances, kids were split from their mothers by decree without clarification. One woman remembered tallying her son's paces as they took him away. She counted up to 20. After that, she heard silence. Surviving a week became a solid gauge. It was not a figure of speech. Whoever was still living after 7 days had learned something vital: how not to gaze, when to crouch, whom to shun. A former captive narrated that on the first day he acted like a liberated man, on the second like someone dazed, on the third like someone who had realized that every motion could be penalized. By the 5th day, he no longer posed queries. On the 7th, he ceased thinking about time. The physique adjusted before the psyche. Permanent starvation, random strikes, and a want of distinct regulations erased any optimism. The initial few months were defined by instability. There were no steady habits. One day they were laboring at the brick plant. The next, they were excavating ditches for no clear cause. One account speaks of a squad made to dig all night in the rain and at sunrise watch as other detainees were shoved into the pits they themselves had excavated. No one clarified the motive. An explanation was not required. Watching was sufficient. That was a fixture. Data moved through sights, not words. At some stage, without any proclamation or observable cue, everybody grasped the same thing. There was no chat or broad decree. It was a sluggish, gradual realization. One inmate recalled that he understood when he viewed a robust man who had withstood beatings for days drop to his knees and never rise again. No person aided him. No person stirred. At that instant, he realized that survival relied not on power or guiltlessness, but on elements beyond his command. Others stated they realized it upon hearing the river at night and sensing that it was not merely water running. The camp was still being arranged, but the rationale was already evident to those inside. It did not matter if someone had been brought there by error or based on a sham charge. It did not matter if they had appeared with papers or without. Age did not matter. Entering Jasenovac meant embracing a reality without warranties. Every day you gained something fresh, and that knowledge always arrived too late. Factory-scale killing with ordinary implements. From the onset, the countryside functioned on the foundation of direct, observable, and intimate brutality. There was no effort to conceal the deed of slaying behind a device. It was woven into the daily existence of the countryside. One survivor claimed that in Jasenovac, you did not perish elsewhere. You perished where you were standing. That trait defined the total system. The instruments used were not industrial arms, but everyday items. Mallets, hammers, blades, hatchets, metal rods. The most commonly cited weapon in the stories was the Sebosiek, a hooked blade fitted to a leather mitt, crafted to swiftly slit throats. It was not a standard-issue arm, but a homemade modification passed among the centuries. Spades, saws, and wire were also utilized. In numerous instances, the identical tools used during the day for coerced labor were used at night to slay. One account details how a guard rested a blood-stained spade against the barracks wall and used it again at sunrise to excavate ditches. The brutality had cadences. It was not ceaseless or anarchic. There were times of accumulation and times of discharge. Mass slayings were usually focused at night or at dawn. During the day, thrashings, degradations, and illustrative deaths set the tempo of the toil. A prior captive narrated that each day started with a tally in which people were constantly absent, and no one inquired about them. Silence was part of the process. The camp learned to operate with this lack as the rule. The slayer's weariness was also part of the design. Not all sentries could kill for hours without pause. The stories speak of casual shifts, makeshift breaks, and guards who would withdraw to drink after a day of slayings. In certain cases, fatigue led to a shift in technique. A later record notes that after nights of steady killings, mass executions were utilized to hasten things, not out of benevolence, but due to bodily depletion. The brutality was not infinite. It required bodies able to execute it. Slaying also served as an internal show, not for the outer world, but for the sentries and captives themselves. Public slayings filled a teaching role. One survivor remembered how inmates were made to shape a half-circle, while a male was thrashed to death without any yells or talks, only the display of the deed. The guards looked on, remarked, sometimes placed wagers. This use of death as a show strengthened ranks and dehumanized those who looked. To gaze was part of the penalty. The boundary between penalty and eradication was never plainly drawn. A captive could be battered as discipline and perish in the process. Others were slain for the smallest violations, strolling too slowly, lifting their heads, talking too quietly. One story notes a man slain for not taking off his cap swiftly enough. No person differentiated between fixing and removing. This vagueness was practical. It permitted slaying without needing to validate each death as part of a bigger scheme. Precise numbers are hard to determine exactly because of its non-industrial style. There were no full logs. However, later reports and accounts concur that tens of thousands of people were slain in Jasenovac by direct means. Some days witnessed hundreds of deaths. On special events, such as religious holy days or revenges, slayings increased. One paper cites Christmas 1941 as one of those spikes. Figures matter less than rhythm. Slaying was an essential role of the field. As the months went by, the savagery ceased to startle. That does not imply it stopped hurting, but rather that it stopped producing a noticeable response. The captives learned not to gaze. The guards learned not to halt. One survivor stated the most frightening instant was not the first slaying he saw, but the day he felt nothing while viewing it. That was for many the true breaking point when brutality ceased to be an occurrence and became a steady background. Who slew more? The rivalry between the chiefs of Jasenovac. Authority at Jasenovac was not in the grasp of schooled officers or career administrators. The camp was ruled by Ustasha staff, whose prime credentials were political devotion and past background in violence. Many lacked martial schooling and management skill. They hailed from exile, from secret acts, from assaults, or from regional suppression in villages and along routes. This lack of formal training was not a hurdle. It was a benefit. It allowed for motion without set methods, without technical doubts, and without the need to justify choices. Power was not grounded on rules, but on instant dread. The core figure in the system was Vyacheslav Luburic, known as Max. He was not only the head of Jasenovac, but of all the regime's camps. He reported directly to Ante Pavlich's inner ring and could step in without middlemen. Luburic often toured the camp, checked barracks, watched slayings, and gave unlogged vocal commands. A story collected after the war depicts him strolling among the captives while gesturing with his stick at those who should be removed later. That later was seldom clarified. Below Luburic, day-to-day rule was managed by commanders and deputy chiefs who swapped rapidly. These included Ivica Matkovic, Ljubo Milos, and Dinko Sakic, among others. The post was neither steady nor safe. Power acted as a fleeting prize. Those who showed hardness, drive, and viewable results could be raised. There were no formal tests or written standards. The gauge was simple: how many captives entered, how many ceased to exist, and how little noise the process made. This logic bred rivalry. The chiefs knew they were being viewed both by Luburic and Zagreb. Brutality became a way to prove worth. A former sentry claimed that being soft could cost you your post. Some accounts note implied matches, remarks about who had purged a section of the field faster. There was no official goal figure to hit, but there was steady strain not to drop behind. The violence became a contest with no end mark. The tie with Zagreb was unclear. The regime required Jasenovac to fix a political and population issue, but it also had to answer to outer strains, largely from Germany. Berlin insisted on order and a level of foresight. When local killings caused turmoil, gossip, or disrupted rail shipping, gripes emerged. This did not imply halting the brutality, but rather governing its shape. On several times, Luburic was called to Zagreb to give reasons. He always went back with more might. The lack of clear penalties strengthened the notion that nearly anything was permitted. Issues grew when someone went too far in an unsuited way. Not because they slew too many folks, but because they did it poorly. There were recorded instances of officers removed for causing chaos, for pilfering goods that should have been officially seized, or for causing internal fights. One chief was swapped after a span of such chaotic brutality that it hurt the output of coerced work. Another fell from favor for letting certain captives stay alive longer than planned in return for payoffs. The surplus was not moral, it was operational. One of the best-known instances was the swapping of Ivica Matkovic in 1943. During his rule, savagery hit levels that were deemed harmful even within the regime. Accounts concur that the slayings became unchecked with bad impacts on internal order. Matkovic was not instantly tried or penalized. He was taken from his seat and moved to another task. The note was plain. It was not about slaying fewer people, but about slaying them in a way that was more useful for the network. Shifts in leadership did not signify gains for the inmates. Each substitute brought tweaks, not ease. One survivor remembered that whenever a fresh chief arrived, the first few days were the direst. The new boss had to claim his sway, stamp his ground, and prove that he would not be doubted. This involved group penalties, public slayings, and a brief rise of brutality. The countryside learned to dread these shift periods more than the habit itself. The might structure in Jasenovac was intentionally centered on persons. There was no administration to cushion choices. Everything relied on specific men, their nature, their drive, and their tie with the regime's heads. This reliance made the system shaky, but also supremely violent. Every chief knew that their continued work relied on proving viewable results in a brief span of time. Human life became a performance metric. Over time, this logic yielded a contradiction. The field functioned, but only at the price of a savagery that required steady fixes. The swapping of chiefs was not an exclusion, but part of the gear. Each shift restated the core note. Power in Jasenovac was not managed. It was wielded. Existence in a spot where it was impossible to dwell. Inside Jasenovac, daily being was planned to be unbearable, and every part had a precise role. Starvation was not a byproduct of chaos, but a gauged instrument. Ilya Ivanovic, born in a Serbian hamlet in Bosnia and seized in 1942 during the raids following Kozara, remembered that the daily share was usually cut to a cloudy broth, made from skins and bits, and sometimes a hand-sized chunk of dark loaf. He said that the scent of the loaf was more strong than its flavor, and that some sentries would display it before the tally and then stow it away without dealing it out. That repeated act taught a simple class. Meals were not tied to toil or compliance, but to impulse. The coerced work had no clear fiscal aim. Trenches were excavated and then blocked in again the next day. Bricks were hauled from the old plant to a spot in the countryside and then back again. Milan Babic, a Serbian peasant from the zone around Prijedor, said he spent weeks bearing mud with his naked hands, without mitts or implements, until his skin split and his nails dropped off. No person was tracking the result of the labor. Constructing anything did not matter. Draining bodies already enfeebled by starvation was what counted. Work was extended penalty, not output. Falling ill was equal to being marked. There was no true medical aid. The sheds missed drugs, wraps, or cots. Dysentery and typhus moved swiftly through the forms. Petar Kovacevic, a metalworker from a hamlet near Banja Luka, narrated that during the head count, a male with a severe fever fell. He asked leave to sit down. A sentry struck him with a cane until he stopped stirring. The following day, his space in the barracks was vacant. The malady solved what the management did not want to resolve openly. Dread was used selectively, never evenly. The same faction was not always penalized, nor for the identical cause. One day he was an aged man, the next a robust young male. Drazen Juricic, a scholar held in Zagreb, said that the guards would pick someone at whim during labor and strike him in front of everyone without reason. No person knew what they had done amiss. The note was not to fix conduct, but to prove that there was no such thing as secure conduct. That randomness kept everyone on constant guard. Gossip acted as a check system. In the lack of formal data, everything moved in quiet voices. There was chat of moves to Germany, foreign reviews, and potential freedoms. Some tales were even begun by the sentries themselves. Ivanovic remembered a night when it was proclaimed that there would be a sorting process the next day for off-field tasks. Many did not sleep. At sunrise, several captives were taken from the sheds and did not return. The tale had filled its goal, to keep everyone taut and on guard. Nighttime was the most feared time. After the count, when the gates shut, the noises started. Far yells, lone shots, quick steps on the wet soil. Nikola Petrovich, a woodworker from a village on the Sava River, said he learned to tell apart the sounds, the crisp thud of a spade, the pulling of a form, the hush that ensued. No person asked queries. No person stood up. Some blocked their ears, others tallied the seconds between one sound and the next. The night brought no ease. It brought biding. As time went by, the sense of time shifted. There was no almanac or outer guide point. The days were alike, but not the identical. Ivanovich penned that he ceased tallying the days when he realized he no longer awaited the sunrise with ease. The day was no better than the night. They were both part of the same thing. Staying alive stopped being sized in weeks or months and started being sized in hours. There was a distinct moment for each captive when time ceased to exist as a concept. For Stjepan Vukovic, a Croatian worker seized after being flagged, it was when he ceased recalling his girl's birth date. For others, it was after the initial death of someone near to him. The countryside filled all of his mental room. Past and future were squeezed into a non-stop present without vows or plain finishes. Starvation, useless toil, sickness, picky dread, tales and infinite nights shaped a logical system. It was not needed to slay them all instantly. It was sufficient to keep them living long enough for them to grasp where they were. The query that stays open is what lingers of a human when even the flow of time ceases to give shelter. Falsehoods for global guests. During the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht started to log a repeating trend. Hamlets where there were no grown men left, rail ruin in newly calmed zones, and a quickened spread of partisan bands. Accounts from the German 15th Army Corps plane stated that aimless brutality was turning whole zones into hostile lands. In September of that year, an inner note marked that the Croatian line of total suppression is yielding results opposite to safety goals. There was no chat yet of wiping out, but there was chat of a force out of check. In October 1941, the name Jasenovac shows up more clearly in SD security accounts bound for Berlin, not as just another site, but as the prime concentration camp. These papers depict it as a central holding camp, with rising volume and scarce administrative watch. German worry was not centered on the camp's being, but on its running, lack of log-keeping, open slayings, and disjointed theft. The issue was that all of this fed the revolt that Germany was trying to crush. The so-named global visits started in 1942 when outer strain grew. Italian envoys, mainly from the occupation belts of Dalmatia and Montenegro, passed reports to Rome from Serbian exiles detailing mass slayings. Italy, which was vying with Croatia for sway in the Balkans, used these stories to doubt the Ustasha's skill to rule. It was not a case of pity, but of state rivalry. Even so, those gripes reached Berlin and added to an increasingly tricky image of the Croatian regime. The tours that occurred were not full checks. In April 1942, Italian agents gained entry to zones near the camp network, but not to the most savage core of Jasenovac. The Croatian officials fixed the scene beforehand, tidying viewable spots, briefly halting penalties and picking captives able to stand. Later stories concur that those days were odd. Extra meal was dealt out, sentries were told to keep their space, and killing tools were masked. The countryside did not deny its crushing role, but showed it as managed. That same year, accounts started to flow, though they were never made public. German commanders wrote inner notes detailing in greater depth what was occurring in Jasenovac. One of them, dated July 1942, spoke of ways that mirror pogroms more than state rule. That paper was sealed and did not lead to any instant act. Other accounts were soaked up by wider studies of the state in the Balkans, thinning the distinctness of the field within a broad scene of brutality. The Vatican also got data through its post in Zagreb and local clerics. Mails and stories arrived detailing mass displacements and vanishings. In November 1941, a church report plainly noted the splitting of kids and the death of inmates from starvation and sickness. The Vatican's replies were wary. They chose private acts, case by case, appeals for mercy and backing for kind plans. There was no public blame. The prime goal was to save paths of talk with a regime that showed itself as Catholic in a setting of total war. The so-named freedoms acted as tactful tools. In 1942 and 1943, tiny bands of captives, mainly kids, were freed or moved to civil homes. These deeds were stressed by Zagreb as evidence that Jasenovac was not a killing camp. However, the figures were tiny weighed against the full sum of detainees. Furthermore, many of these freedoms were in reply to exact strains, not to basic shifts. Some of those freed died shortly after from the lingering effects of their jailing. Others vanished during following moves. The freeing served more as a point than as a fix. The tactful hush was the fruit of a string of estimates. Germany required martial steadiness and did not want to rock an ally in the midst of a battle against the partisans. Italy used Croatian horrors as a policy tool, but without any true aim of halting them. Neutral states missed the ways to intercede and put first their own life. The Western allies got data, but they merged it into a scene of huge crimes that seemed incurable in the short run. Jasenovac was not sole on the chart of European terror, and that ran against it. The state use of unknowing was clear. Not formally proving allowed them to dodge taking steps. Keeping the data within shut rings barred public vows. Each player found a cause not to take the knowledge to its final end. The Croatian regime deftly used this vagueness as long as there was no formal and joined blame. It could keep running. Attacks were shaped in terms of glut, mess, or inability, never as charges of planned crime that asked for a split. Even after the war, many of these papers took years to come to light. Some stayed filed well into the post-war era. Others were used selectively, hinging on new state balances. The following tale tended to streamline duties, focusing on figures and ranks, leaving in the rear the net of hushes and plans that let Jasenovac work for years with outer knowledge. The outer world knew enough to grasp that Jasenovac was not just a plain holding camp. It knew that folk were dying en masse there, that the brutality was not chance, and that its impacts reached far past the fences. What was missing was the drive to change that knowledge into act that would shift the flow of events. Managed tours, filed accounts, token freedoms, and tactful speech built a grey zone in which truth could be admitted without being faced. The offspring of Jasenovac. The kids came to Jasenovac without a clear entry hour. They did not always get off the same trains as the grown-ups, nor were they taken along the identical routes. Sometimes they showed up later in split trucks. Other times they were pulled from already thinned lines. The split did not follow a set rule. It happened on the dock at a junction in front of a barn. Mothers were waved away. Kids were shoved to the other side. Nothing showed that this split was lasting, but it nearly always was. A Serbian female from the Kozara zone swore that she tallied her boy's paces as he was led away. She reached 12 before a sentry struck her and made her gaze straight ahead. She never viewed him again. For the Ustasha rule, kids did not fit into any helpful class. They did not labor. They could not be castigated in the same mode as adults, and they did not pose an instant foe. This turned them into a working issue. Inner accounts cited them as excess or weight. The camp was not set to house them en masse, and yet they kept coming. Ad-libbing was the reply. They were heaped up in side spaces, in idle structures, in rude barracks. There was no plan, only brief fixes that became abiding due to fatigue. This is how the so-named camps within the camp rose. Split sectors, at times poorly fenced, where kids of mixed ages were massed. In some cases, they were barns with earth floors and low roofs. In others, they were old factory sites without panes. The youths slept bunched together without enough cots or quilts. The chill and damp did the rest. One survivor remembered seeing 5- or 6-year-old kids trying to shield themselves with bits of sackcloth. There were no playthings, no texts, no tasks. Time went by in a total blank. The choice not to log names was planned. Unlike other captives, kids were seldom listed when such lists even existed. Ages and routes were not logged. This made any later check hard and erased the chance of claims. A child without a name left no mark for the camp rule that eased everything. There was no need to formally settle their lot. It was sufficient to just leave them there. A later story from an Ustasha guard notes that no person asked about them. That phrase sums up a line. Health states were nil. Illnesses ran fast. Dysentery, itch, typhus. There was no distinct health aid for kids. Those who fell sick were left lying on the ground. Some were taken for cleansing. It was unsure what that meant. Others simply vanished during the night. An adult survivor recalled seeing at sunrise the bare space where a band of kids had slept the night before. No person said a word. Silence was how they dealt with the gone. In that setting, the unclear role of outer civilians arose. Females tied to kind or church groups, or simply neighbors who managed to enter the camp at specific times. They did not enter freely. They needed passes, links, drive. Some managed to take bands of kids with the claim of moving them to homes or care families. These were not always planned saves. Sometimes they were lone acts, settled on a case-by-case basis. A Croatian woman recalled taking 2 girls with her without even knowing their names. She only knew they could not stay there. Not all moves ended in safety, but for some kids they meant the split between continuing to exist or vanishing without a mark. Surviving without grasping was the shared trial. The kids did not know where they were or why. They asked about their kin. They asked when they would go home. No person replied. Some ceased posing queries. A male who had been a child in Jasenovac remembers that he learned not to weep because weeping drew blows. He learned to watch the adults and copy them. He learned to stay still for hours. He did not grasp the risk, but he grasped the penalty. That partial grasp was sufficient to keep him living for another day. The flow of time moved the kids differently. Some aged fast, others faded quickly. The youngest kids died without anyone noting. The older ones started to take on slight duties, bringing water, tidying spaces, minding other kids. This role swap happened without shift. A 10-year-old child could become a guide for 6 or 7-year-olds, not out of sway, but for life. That loose form took the place of any state plan. When the kids were gone, what stayed was a blank that was hard to depict. The spaces they had filled were not instantly reused. Marks stayed. Bits of wear, small tracks in the mud, the odd crude item. An adult survivor remembered finding days later a plait of hair bound with a string. He did not know whom it had belonged to. Nobody knew. Those types of scraps were not listed in accounts or counts. They were human dross from a system that had not tallied them. The lot of the kids of Jasenovac was neither single nor steady. Some died in the field, others were moved and died later. A few lived thanks to outer acts, but they all shared the same start state, having been deemed a trouble without a clear fix. The lack of a plan did not mean a lack of results. On the contrary, steady ad-libbing defined their lot. The tour of German officer Siegfried Kascher. The account reached Berlin in late 1942, by which time the zone between the Sava River, the Kozara, and northern Bosnia had become ungovernable. Martial accounts all depicted the same signs. Frequent rail ruin, whole hamlets left, lines of exiles moving blindly, and a steady influx of armed men joining the partisan units. For the German lead, the issue was no longer ideological or news-linked. It was working. The Ustasha crushing was not calming the land, it was setting it aflame. Someone in Berlin needed to grasp why. And that man who would answer the queries of the High Command was Siegfried Kascher. Kascher was an officer tasked with focusing German spy work in Croatia. He loved dancing, fancy drinks, but above all he loved being amid Croatians whom he grasped, and above all who looked up to him. Born in 1896, he came from an Austro-Hungarian noble line with direct ties to Croatia. During the First World War, he served as an officer, and his service log held an event that fixed his fame: the guarding of a post under Serbian assault for 3 days without outer aid. By 1940, he was already part of the Nazi party frame and had been named as the German agent to the independent state of Croatia. He was neither a kind soul nor a judge of the Ustasha regime. His path was defined by order, rule, and state bowing. That is exactly why, when he started to spot that something was not working, his notes were hard to snub. As the direct tie between Germany and Croatia, accounts of partisan raids reached him with rising rate. In his inner mails, he depicted a state that, in his view, had become unmanageable even for those who had made it. In that string of accounts that rose from local rule to Berlin, the name Jasenovac started to show repeatedly, not as a side detail, but as a cycling factor in the land's ruin. It was not only cited as a holding camp, but as the end goal of thousands of people whose vanishing was having viewable state and war results. In that setting, Kasia was told to step in, not to try or blame, but to clear up why the Croatian crushing was yielding the reverse impact to that sort. He went back to Zagreb and made the plea directly. He did not ask for a formal tour or a public check. He asked for ample entry to grasp how Jasenovac worked in fact. The reply was stalling. Safety reasons, time clashes, and climate states were quoted. Weeks passed. Each stall proved what he already guessed. Jasenovac was not a spot that was open to the public, not even to friends. Only after frequent push and making it clear that the affair had reached upper powers did he gain a narrow pass. The trip was telling from the start. Kasia was first taken to a near German post and from there moved to Croatian care. The last leg was done with an armed guard in separate cars with no room to halt or veer. The route was poorly marked and in plainly bad shape. It was not a path planned for visits, but for odd transit. During the ride, talk was sparse and the chats tight, having to sip from his flask often to mask the scent of the zone full of bodies in the woods. The commands were passed around in Croatian in quiet tones. Kasia felt that his being there bred unease rather than respect. The viewable core of the trip was the old brick plant. The main structure kept clear scraps of its factory use, tracks set in the ground, dead ovens, soot-covered walls. There were no signs or clear lines between labor zones, holding zones, or penalty zones. The same space could act as a shop during the day and as a spot of detention or slaying at night. This layering was not masked. It was taken to be part of how things ran. Kasia noted that there were no separate walking halls. Captives, sentries, and goods shared the same tight paths. The barracks he was let to see were long, low builds made with shapeless boards and wavy metal roofs. The gaps were tiny. Inside there were no fixed walls. Cots, when they existed, were simply piled wood decks. In other parts, captives slept straight on the ground. There were no visible air or drain systems. The air was stale, even in broad sun. The lighting relied on odd gaps and a few crudely powered hanging bulbs. The rim did not form a solid and even fence. There were beefed-up parts and others added at the last tick. The watchtowers were few and mixed, some made of wood, others were simple high decks. In several spots, watch was done with sentries set at ground level, seen, armed, and without shield. The goal was not to stop flight through building, but through direct being. Kasia also noted the lack of clearly distinct office builds. He saw no rooms with files or spaces solely meant for rule. Office roles seemed melted within the site. The same room could serve for talks, storage, and punishment. The building style mirrored a lack of useful splits. Ruling, watching, and slaying all took place within the same solid frame. Every bid to halt and view a detail was cut off. When he asked about the full size of the field, he got dim answers. When he tried to grasp how the various sectors were tied, he was led astray. The tour moved ahead and back without a clear sequence, as if the aim was not to show a sound whole, but split scraps. That splitting was in itself news. The field was not meant to be grasped from the outside. He was not permitted to speak to inmates or lower staff. The clarifications always came from the same officers who depicted the spaces in tiny working terms. This is where you labor. This is where you dwell. This is not German. Kasia grasped that structure did not mask the acts of the countryside. It normalized them. Each build seemed brief, but the whole thing had been working for months. That mix, steady ad-libbing and non-stop use, was one of the traits that alarmed him most. In his later notes, he spoke of the ruling hue, the brown of mud mixed with ash, the grey of wrecked factory builds, the black of ragged garbs. He marked the lack of sameness even among the sentries. Some in full Ustasha dress, others in plain clothes, mixed boots, ill-set badges. For a German used to a fixation with shape, that detail was telling. Scent was one of the first things he cited, not as a figure, but as a fact, a stubborn blend of fumes, rotting life matter, and sweat. He wrote that the place is felt before it is seen. He made no note of chambers or technical gear. He spoke of tools leaning against the walls of spaces that served many roles without clear split. For him, that was not skill, it was mess. What hit him most was the lack of sound logs. He asked for lists, entry digits, moves. The replies were loose. There was talk of purged units and vital steps, but no solid paper could be shown. Kasha noted that this looseness was not chance. It let people act without being held to account. It let them deny it later. For the German mode, that was an issue, not because of the savage act itself, but because it barred the gauging of outcomes. After the trip, the talks were blunt. Kasha faced the Croatian chiefs with a critique that would be echoed in other accounts. Blind cruelty was forming more foes than it was purging. Whole villages were being drained. Men with no prior tie with the revolt took up arms after viewing what happened to their kin. The Ustasha replied with dogma points, cleansing, past fate, need. Kasha did not debate those ideas, he debated results. In Berlin, his account was met with a chill technical welcome. He did not call for the camp to be shut. He posed ordering slayings, shrinking their view, and curbing the acts that fed the revolt. The paper went around, was stored, and ended in slight tweaks. Jasenovac kept running. The brutality did not halt. It just became less messy at times. The crowd fled from Jasenovac. By April 1945, the camp was no longer a steady tool of the Ustasha regime, but a risky scrap. In the prior weeks, the war ring had tightened. Yugoslav partisan bands, under the rule of Josip Broz, dubbed Tito, were moving from Bosnia into northern Croatia. The Sava Valley was a fort zone. The trains ran at night and with guards. The side roads were hopeless due to the count of raids. For the sentries of Jasenovac, the outer world no longer held any bonds. Inside their grounds, the shift was stark and concrete. Since the end of March, the shares fell sharply. The loaf arrived moist in uneven bits. The broth was cut to dark water with scraps of peel. The tallies became briefer and more brutal. The folders started to vanish. Captives set to cleaning saw heaps of papers burning behind the shops, partial rosters, hand notes, seals. At night, the smoke did not clear. A survivor, Jakov Finci, a Jew from Sarajevo, remembered that the scent of burnt paper mixed with that of the forms. They were not shutting the camp, they were wiping it. The night slayings grew. Bands taken from the sheds did not return. The shots were heard at set spaces as if someone were fixing the rate. Ilya Ivanovic, a Serbian peasant from the Kozara zone, wrote that that week he ceased tallying the days and started tallying the pits in the soil where others slept. Every dawn there was more room, he noted. The tales were no longer clashing. There would be no moves, there would be no freedoms. The end would be inner. By then, between 1,000 and 1,200 captives stayed in the main Jasenovac site. Nearly all of them men. Many were ill, but a core band was still able to run. Among them were Ante Barak, a Croatian metal worker, Milan Kovacevic, a Serbian farmer from Dubica, Eugen Dincic, a Jew from Zagreb, and Vlado Singer, a prior sergeant in the Yugoslav army. They did not form a formal body, but they shared one truth. To bide was to perish. For days they had swapped glances, short phrases, alerts. There were no talks. There was a mute deal. The spark came on April 21st. That night, a huge group was taken out for shipping. The firing started a few minutes later. No person returned. The next dawn, several sheds were half void. Ante Barak remembered that as he lined up, he grasped that the play was entering its final stage. There were no more steps. He would later say that morning the sure thing was chosen to smash the siege during the morning toil when the sentries were spread. There was no single chief. The thought moved like an undercurrent. The basics were set upon. Strike the nearest sentries with tools, run towards the spots where the wire was lower, and do not halt for anyone. The arms would be mauls, crude blades, spades, iron rods. No person spoke of surviving as a band. Each person grasped that flight would be solo. The dawn of the 22nd of April, 1945 began without any visible cues. The captives were taken from the barracks and put to tasks. Some were shaking, others seemed weirdly calm. Eugen Dincic would recall that on that day he felt not dread but a kind of blankness. When the cue was given a sudden raid on a close guard, the camp burst. The first blows were savage and messy. One sentry fell, another opened fire. The din was instant and total. Around 600 men started sprinting. Many dropped within the first few meters. The earth was muddy, boots slid, wire sliced flesh. Shots came from towers and from the soil. Milan Kovacevic saw his cousin drop 2 paces away. He did not halt. "If I paused, he would have died right there," he would say. Some managed to span the fence. Others were left hanging and were shot at close range. The field, which had never been quiet, became a steady boom. Vlado Singer, hurt in the limb, managed to span a ditch and enter a wooded zone. He hid under branches for hours. He heard yells and gunfire until dusk. Without water or food, he kept north the next day. 2 days later, he met a partisan scout. Ilya Ivanovich crept with a leg gash. He hid in a vacant barn and lived thanks to a woman who left him water without speaking to him. Yakov Finchi ran blindly until he fell from fatigue. He woke at night and felt his way to the woods. Of the roughly 600 who tried to flee, only about 80 lived. Many died during the flight. Others were caught in the following hours and days and slain. Inside the camp, the Ustasha response was instant and firm. The captives who had not fled were slain that same day. Barns burned down, shops wrecked, rubble thrown into the Sava River. Jasenovac ceased to exist as a camp on April 22nd. What ensued was ruin. When the partisan bands arrived in the zone, they found smoking wrecks and silence. There was no freeing. There was a void. The survivors spread to makeshift clinics, rear guard units, ruined hamlets. Their tales started to flow instantly, not as an epic yarn, but as a caution. None of them spoke of triumph. They talked about racing, mud, gunshots, about not looking back. The partisan setting was key, not because of direct act on the field, but because it shut all state exits. With the front nearing, the Ustasha regime lost the chance of moves, drills, talks. At that point, Jasenovac became futile even to its owners. The logic was plain and brutal: purge the witnesses. The captives grasped this before it even happened. The mass flight was not a planned revolt from the outer side, nor a mapped brave deed. It was a break born from the shared truth that waiting no longer gave any edge. Ante Barak summed it up years later. "We did not run to save ourselves, but because staying meant vanishing." That day, hundreds of men took a tiny chance as their only choice. Argentina and the finding of horror. When the war shut in the Balkans, there was no Allied landing at Jasenovac in the standard sense. By May 1945, the camp was no longer working. It had been cleared, set alight, and partly razed by the retreating Ustasha themselves. What the forces that moved on the area, mainly units of the Yugoslav partisans, found was a wrecked space coated with human scraps, ashes, burnt builds, and open holes. The camp had not awaited to be found. It had been left in a rush, as if those who ran it knew there was no way to mask it anymore. They found no captives to free. They found spread witnesses, some survivors of the flight of April 22nd, 1945, dwellers of close hamlets who for years had seen lines of exiles vanish without return, and material signs hard to arrange. From the start, the query was not whether there had been crimes, but how to record them in a spot where nearly everything had been ruined. During the summer of 1945, the first formal probes began. Yugoslav teams scanned the zone, opened mass graves, gathered human scraps, and questioned survivors. The initial accounts were broken, but they agreed on one vital point. Jasenovac had not been a standard holding camp, but a long-killing hub with changing modes and brutality held over time. Unlike other European camps, much of the solid proof had been taken, forcing the rebuilding of events from human stories, scattered bits, and partial papers. In 1946, the Croatian State Commission for the Investigation of Crimes of the Ustasha regime printed one of the first state reports. The paper depicted mass slayings, moves, coerced work, and the planned purge of Serbs, Jews, Roma, and Croatian foes. It was used as proof in local legal suits and moved in tactful circles. However, its global spread was narrow. Europe was full with newly found terrors, and Jasenovac was vying for notice with other already well-known scenes. The Western allies, British and American, did not put Jasenovac first on their instant plans. His focus was on Germany, on the camps freed by his own troops, and on major global legal suits. Yugoslavia, further, was starting to rise as a free socialist state, which swayed the greeting of its reports. Data about Jasenovac lived, but it did not hold a central spot in the Western tale of the war. Justice was slanted and uneven. Some of those liable died before being tried. Others were slain in swift hearings. Many never faced a bench. To that partial scene was added a chapter that did not occur in Europe, but which proved vital for the lot of several of those liable. The flight to Argentina. Between 1945 and the early 1950s, Argentina became one of the main goals for former high-ranking staff and mid-level officers of the Ustasha regime. It was not a lone or hasty trend. It worked thanks to well-set evasion nets, fake papers in many cases issued by the Red Cross, and a policy mood that during certain spans ranked the reception of anti-communist migrants. The most plain case was that of Ante Pavelic, head of the independent state of Croatia, and finally politically liable for the camp system, including Jasenovac. Pavelic fled from Yugoslavia in 1945, passed through Austria and Italy, and landed in Buenos Aires in 1948 under a sham name. He lived first in the capital and then in towns in the inland. For years, he moved within a group of Croatian exiles, kept policy ties, and set up bodies in flight. Yugoslavia asked for his hand over on several times. These pleas were fruitless. Pavelic died in 1959 without having faced a bench. More direct and proven was the case of Dinko Sakic, former chief of Jasenovac. He arrived in Argentina in the late 40s, along with his wife Nada Luberic, sister of Vjekoslav Luberic. He first settled in Buenos Aires and then in Santa Teresita on the Atlantic shore. He lived for decades under his real name, ran a small trade, and joined in Croatian group acts. His past was known in shut circles, but it was not formally probed for years. The breaking point came in 1998 when a TV chat in which Sakic openly claimed duty for his role in Jasenovac sparked an instant global backlash. Yugoslavia, already in the step of melting, and later Croatia, asked for his hand over. The Argentine state agreed. Sakic was sent back, tried in Zagreb, and doomed in 1999 to 20 years in jail for crimes against mankind. He died in prison in 2008. He was one of the few people directly liable for Jasenovac who faced a formal suit decades later. There were other, less well-known, but equally telling cases. Mid-ranking officers and office staff entered Argentina using fake names. Some settled in Buenos Aires, others in inland zones. In most cases, there was no legal hunt, either due to a lack of claims, the lack of potent pacts, or the hardship of proving specific duties due to the ruin of files in Jasenovac. These flights were not a history mishap. They were part of a cross-border web of dodging that shifted the issue of accounting to another landmass. The blow was twofold. On the one hand, it barred a full legal rebuilding. On the other, it stretched the silence. Key witnesses never spoke. Those liable died without being quizzed. The late news that Jasenovac's killers had lived for decades in Argentina confirmed something wider. The post-war span did not shut all fronts. While some camps became global signs of horror, others were trapped in split paths, with those liable spread among jails, nameless pits, and cozy exiles. This chapter does not close the tale of the camp, but rather stretches it. It shows that the end of the war did not mean the end of duties, but but the start of a spread that made the global grasp of what happened in Jasenovac more hard and slow. Those who lived through Jasenovac after the flight and the fall of the camp, the survivors did not follow the same road. There was no single after. There were split paths, long hushes, and tales that took decades to take public shape. One of the best proven cases is that of Ilija Ivanović. This Serbian male from the Kozara zone moved to the camp in 1942, managed to outlive the system and the final months of quickened purging. After the war, he stayed in Yugoslavia and did not speak openly for years. Only in the later stages of the post-war span did he leave a written account of his trial. His story did not focus on figures or global rebuilds, but on tiny scenes, kept hunger, night dread, the daily loss of mates. Ivanović did not become a global public figure. His testimony moved first in local rings and then in school ones. He was one of the voices that made it possible to rebuild what daily existence was like inside the camp when there were no longer any viewable builds left that spoke for themselves. Other survivors took even quieter roads. Some of the men who fled on April 22, 1945, instantly joined partisan bands. For them, the end of the camp did not mean the end of the war. They kept battling for weeks or months. Several died in following acts without ever having told what happened in Jasenovac. Others were treated for grave wounds and were left marked for life by body after effects, chronic germs, cuttings, lasting work loss. In those cases, witness was cut to claims before local boards or to kin tales passed mainly by word. There were also Jewish survivors who left Yugoslavia after the war. Some moved to Israel, others to Western Europe or America. In many cases, Jasenovac was absorbed within a larger trial of hunting and removal. For those who had been through several camps or ghettos, the memory of Jasenovac was just one more link in a chain of violence. This layering added to the camp taking a long time to fill its own place in the global memory of the Holocaust. For many, hush was a later survival plan. In post-war Yugoslavia, the state tale ranked anti-fascist unity and partisan fight. Solo stories that did not easily fit into that frame tended to fade away. Some survivors felt their trial was being used as a sign, but not heard in its exactness. Others simply moved on without leaving a log. Over time, the physical spot of Jasenovac also underwent shifts. During the early post-war years, the site stayed partly deserted. The ruins, pits, and scraps were not instantly turned into a shrine. Only in later decades did a planned process of marking the space start. The goal was not to rebuild the field as it had been, but to point out its being and its role. Today, the zone where the complex once stood is the Jasenovac Memorial Site. The view is intentionally stark. There are no full rebuilds of barracks or set stages. Void rules. The central shrine and abstract build does not explain, show, or act out. It makes a point around it. Plaques, trails, and open spaces show where there were builds, shops, and killing zones. The guest does not see the field. He walks on what is no longer there. That choice stems from a late grasp. Jasenovac was a place where the wrecking was so thorough that bodily rebuilding it would risk falsifying it. What stays today are files, regained names, and bits. The place acts as a space for asking rather than showing. Jasenovac was not a freak or an outlier within the violence of the 20th century. It was a camp conceived, run, and kept by a state that viewed wiping out as a valid tool of rule. It did not work because of undue chaos, but because of a mix of dogma, inner rivalry, and a planned lack of bounds. The brutality was not a flop of the system. It was its mode. Unlike other camps, Jasenovac did not leave behind grand building or whole factory gear. He left behind scraps, partial stories, and long hushes. That physical lack added to its history being debated, softened, or directly denied for decades. Not because there was a lack of proof, but because the memory was thorny for too many players at the same time. What lasts today is not only the memory of the victims, but the query that the field leaves open. How can a system normalize extreme violence without the need for plain orders, without refined tech, and without a single plan? Jasenovac proves that wiping out does not necessarily require factory speed. It can rise from a mix of dogma, ad-libbing, and unchecked might. Recalling it is not a task in backward horror. It is a history alert, because what happened there was not the fruit of rare madness, but of human choices made within a precise state frame. And that frame with shifts has lived more than once.